3 weeks had passed since the alien assessment, and the reports had already reached the Galactic Council. The verdict was exactly what Admiral Vextar had predicted. Humanity was classified as a dependent species, too weak to properly defend their own territory. The Council had even begun discussions about which empire should take responsibility for protecting human space. Commander Rixtal of the Crystalline Dominion saw this as an opportunity. His people had been looking for new territory to expand their mining operations, and the human system contained several asteroid belts rich in rare minerals. If humanity was as defenseless as the reports claimed, then perhaps a small demonstration of force would convince them to accept crystalline protection willingly. The crystalline fleet moved back into the outer edges of the Sol system, this time with a different purpose. Rixtal had brought only 5 ships, but each one was a masterpiece of crystalline engineering. Their hulls were grown from living crystal that could repair itself and channel energy in ways that organic minds found difficult to understand. Begin weapons testing, Rixtal ordered his fleet. Target the asteroid mining stations. We need to show the humans what real firepower looks like. The first plasma blast lit up space like a small star. It struck an automated mining platform, turning the structure into glowing metal and rock. The explosion was beautiful, Rixtal thought, like a flower blooming in the darkness. The humans would surely understand the message. More shots followed, each one carefully aimed at non-essential targets. A research station here, a fuel depot there. Nothing that would cause massive loss of life, but enough to demonstrate the vast difference in military technology. The crystalline weapons were precise and elegant, turning their targets into clouds of superheated gas without even straining the ship's power systems. The human response came within minutes. A dozen ships emerged from behind the inner planets, moving fast on high-energy burns. These were not the ancient hulks that had been floating in the asteroid belt. These ships were sleek and modern, clearly humanity's active defense fleet. Captain Sarah Chen commanded the human squadron from her flagship, the UES Vigilant. She was a career military officer, trained at Earth's best academies and experienced in dealing with alien contacts. But as she watched the crystalline ships destroy human installations, she felt a cold anger building in her chest. Open a channel to the crystalline commander, Chen ordered. Let's see what they think they're doing. Commander Rixtal's response came in the form of musical tones that carried an undertone of amusement. Captain Chen, I presume, we are conducting weapons tests in this system. Your government was notified through proper diplomatic channels. You're firing on civilian targets, Chen replied, her voice hard. That's an act of war, not a weapons test. War? Rixtal's laugh sounded like crystal bells ringing. Captain, your entire species possesses perhaps 100 active warships. My people have thousands. This is not war. This is education. Chen gritted her teeth. The alien was right about the numbers, and they both knew it. Humanity's active fleet was small and focused mainly on patrol duties and piracy suppression. The ships were good by human standards, but they were not designed to fight the kind of advanced vessels that the galactic powers deployed. Stand down your weapons, Commander, Chen said. We don't want to fight, but we will defend our territory. With what? Rixtal asked. Those toys you call warships? Captain, my vessels could destroy your entire squadron without taking damage. Perhaps it would be better for everyone if you simply withdrew. Chen looked at her tactical display. 12 human ships against 5 crystalline vessels. On paper, the humans had the advantage of numbers. But the crystalline ships were each the size of a human battleship, and their energy shields could probably absorb anything the human fleet could throw at them. All ships attack formation Beta, Chen ordered. Target the lead crystalline vessel. The human ships spread out and began their attack run. Their weapons were kinetic cannons and plasma torpedoes. Solid technology, but nothing compared to the exotic systems used by the galactic powers. The first volley of human weapons struck the crystalline shields and scattered like rain on a window. Rixtal didn't even bother to return fire immediately. He wanted the humans to see how futile their efforts were. His ship's shields absorbed the human weapons without even flickering. The other crystalline vessels continued their weapons testing, destroying more mining platforms while the human fleet attacked uselessly. Captain Chen, Rixtal transmitted, you see now how pointless this is. Your weapons cannot even scratch our shields. Withdraw your ships before I am forced to demonstrate what real military technology can accomplish. Chen watched 2 more human torpedoes explode harmlessly against crystalline shields. Her weapons officer was shaking his head, indicating that their heaviest weapons were having no effect. The tactical situation was hopeless, but Chen was not ready to give up. "All ships concentrate fire on the lead vessel's shield generators," she ordered. Full power to weapons. The human fleet poured everything they had into a focused assault on Rixtal's flagship. For a moment, the crystalline shields flickered under the concentrated fire, but the effect lasted only seconds before the alien ship's power systems compensated. Rixtal decided it was time to end this embarrassing display. "Target the human flagship. Minimal power setting. We want to disable, not destroy." The crystalline energy beam reached out and touched the UES Vigilant. The human ship's shields collapsed instantly and several of its weapon systems went offline. The ship was still intact, but it was clearly helpless. "Stand down, Captain Chen," Rixtal ordered. "Before I lose patience entirely." Chen stared at her dead weapons display. 3 of her ships had been disabled in as many minutes. The rest of her squadron was still firing, but their weapons might as well have been throwing rocks. The crystalline ships were simply too advanced, too powerful for human technology to handle. "All ships cease fire," Chen said quietly. "Fall back to minimum safe distance." As the human ships retreated, Rixtal felt satisfied with the demonstration. The humans had learned their place in the galactic order. Now they would be more willing to accept crystalline protection when the offer was made officially. But something was happening in the asteroid belt that Rixtal did not notice. The ancient human ships that had been drifting silently for weeks were starting to show new activity. Deep space sensors registered power fluctuations as old fusion reactors began their startup sequences. Emergency communication channels that had been silent for decades suddenly came alive with encrypted signals. On Earth, Admiral Morrison sat in the deepest bunker of Earth Defense Command, staring at reports from Captain Chen's failed engagement. The alien demonstration had been clear. Humanity's active fleet was no match for galactic military technology. The species that had spent centuries fighting each other had finally met opponents they could not defeat with conventional forces. Morrison opened a sealed vault and removed a datapad that had not been accessed in 30 years. The authorization codes on the screen were known to only 5 people in the entire human government. The protocol had been established after the Titan Wars, when humanity had nearly destroyed itself in civil conflict. It was meant to be used only if the species faced extinction. "God help us all," Morrison whispered as he entered the first authorization code. In the asteroid belt, the first of the sleeping ships began to come alive. The TNS Retribution, a Terra-class dreadnought that had been dark for 31 years, started its emergency revival sequence. Deep in the ship's core, cryopods that had maintained their frozen cargo for 3 decades began the slow process of awakening their occupants. The aliens had wanted to see humanity's real military capability. They were about to get their wish. Admiral Morrison's hand shook slightly as he entered the final authorization code. Protocol 77 Alpha had been designed during humanity's darkest hour, when the species had nearly torn itself apart in the civil wars that followed the colonization of Mars and Titan. The protocol was meant to awaken humanity's most dangerous military assets. The ships and crews that had been put into deep storage after they had proven too effective, too brutal for peacetime use. The signal went out on quantum channels that had been silent for 3 decades. It reached the Ghost Fleet in seconds, penetrating the deepest parts of ships that most people believed were simply memorials to past conflicts. The message was simple, encoded in patterns that only the sleeping ship's computers would recognize. Condition 77 Alpha. All units to combat readiness, threat level. Species survival. Captain Marcus Kane had been dreaming of Earth. Not the crowded, polluted Earth of his youth, but the Earth that existed in his memories before the wars began. Green fields and blue oceans, cities that sparkled in the sunlight instead of burning under orbital bombardment. He had been 35 when he went into cryo-sleep aboard the TNS Retribution. Now he was technically 66, though his body had aged only a few months during the long freeze. The revival process was never pleasant. Kane's body fought against consciousness as warming systems brought his tissues back to normal temperature. His nervous system screamed as it reconnected with muscles that had been dormant for decades. But his mind was clear, honed by years of combat that most humans could never imagine. Kane opened his eyes to see the familiar ceiling of his command pod. Red emergency lights bathed everything in a bloody glow. Around him, he could hear the sounds of his crew awakening from their own pods, groans of pain, gasps of returning breath, and the occasional curse as someone remembered where they were and why they had been sleeping. "Status report," Kane croaked, his voice rough from disuse. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Voss was the first to respond. She had been Kane's executive officer during the Titan Wars, and she was still the most reliable person he had ever served with. "All primary systems coming online, Captain. Fusion reactor at 40% and climbing. Weapons systems, checking. All green. We have full munitions loads." Kane pulled himself out of his pod and moved carefully to the captain's chair. His legs felt weak, but he knew the feeling would pass. Around the bridge, his crew was going through the same process, checking systems and running diagnostics on equipment that had been waiting in storage for 31 years. "Communications. Get me a channel to Fleet Command," Kane ordered. "I want to know what woke us up." The response came from Admiral Morrison himself, speaking from Earth Defense Command. His voice sounded older than Kane remembered, but then again, Morrison had not spent the last 3 decades in cryosleep. "Marcus, thank God you're awake," Morrison said. "We have a situation. Alien forces have attacked our outer colonies. Our active fleet tried to respond, but their technology is too advanced. We need the Ghost Fleet online and ready for combat." Kane felt the familiar cold sensation in his stomach that always came before a battle. "How many ships are we talking about, Admiral?" 5 crystalline vessels in the outer system. But intelligence suggests they're part of a larger force. The galactic powers think we're defenseless, Marcus. They're testing us to see how we respond. Kane looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. These were people who had fought in humanity's most brutal conflicts. They had served aboard ships that carried weapons too dangerous for normal military use. They had been put into storage not because they were obsolete, but because they were too effective for a species trying to live in peace. "Admiral, how many of the Ghost Fleet ships are coming online?" "All of them, Marcus. 47 vessels total. Terra-class dreadnoughts, Nemesis-class destroyers, and 12 Eclipse-class stealth ships. Everything we put into storage after the Titan Accords." Kane felt a grim smile cross his face. The aliens had no idea what they had awakened. The ships of the Ghost Fleet were not designed to fight other humans in civilized conflicts. They were designed to fight when humanity's survival was at stake, when every weapon was acceptable and every tactic was justified. "Time to full combat readiness?" Kane asked his crew. 6 hours for full crew revival," reported Voss. "But we can fight with minimal crew in 2 hours." "Make it 90 minutes, Kane ordered. "And signal the rest of the fleet. Combat formation Omega. We're going hunting." Throughout the asteroid belt, similar scenes were playing out on dozens of ships. Crews that had gone to sleep during humanity's age of warfare were waking up to find that their services were needed once again. These were not the polished officers of humanity's peacetime navy. These were veterans of conflicts where surrender meant extinction, and mercy was a luxury no one could afford. On the TNS Thanatos, Captain Elena Vasquez was reviewing weapon specifications that civilian oversight committees had classified as war crimes 30 years ago. Her ship carried experimental particle beams that could crack a planet's crust and kinetic weapons that fired projectiles at significant percentages of light speed. Captain Wei, Chen of the TNS Nemesis, was checking the stealth systems that had allowed his ship to operate behind enemy lines during the Mars Rebellion. His vessel could become essentially invisible to most sensors, appearing as nothing more than cosmic background radiation until it was time to strike. And aboard the TNS Eclipse, Captain James Sullivan was awakening a crew of specialists who had been recruited from the darkest corners of human military service. These were people who understood that sometimes, to protect civilization, you had to be willing to abandon it temporarily. The Ghost Fleet had been created during a time when humanity fought itself with the desperation of a species on the edge of extinction. Every ship had been built to maximize damage while minimizing crew requirements. Every weapon system had been designed without regard for international treaties or moral concerns. They were tools of total war, created by a species that had learned to fight like cornered animals. Commander Rixtal was still conducting his weapons testing in the outer system, destroying human installations and marveling at how easily the human defense fleet had been defeated. His ships had taken no damage, and the humans had retreated without inflicting any casualties. It had been almost disappointing how weak they were. "Commander," his sensor officer reported, We're detecting power fluctuations from the human derelict fleet. Rixtal barely looked up from his tactical display. Probably just their maintenance systems. Those old ships are probably falling apart after sitting in space for so long. Sir, the power levels are increasing significantly. Some of those ships are showing fusion signatures comparable to our own vessels. Now Rixtal paid attention. He switched his viewing screen to focus on the asteroid belt where the human ghost fleet had been drifting. What he saw made his crystalline skin shift to a pale blue color of confusion. The human ships were moving, not drifting with the asteroids anymore, but actually maneuvering under their own power. Navigation lights were coming online along their hulls, and he could see exhaust plumes from maneuvering thrusters. The ships were arranging themselves into some kind of formation. Impossible, Rixtal whispered. Those ships have been dead for decades. His communications officer interrupted his thoughts. Commander, we're receiving a transmission from the human fleet. It's on military frequencies. Put it through, Rixtal ordered. The voice that came through the speakers was human, but it carried a tone that Rixtal had never heard from the species before. Cold, professional, and completely without fear. Crystalline vessels, this is Captain Marcus Kane of the Terran Ghost Fleet. You have attacked human civilian targets and declared hostile intent against human territory. You have exactly 10 minutes to withdraw from this system before we respond with appropriate force. Rixtal almost laughed. Human Captain, you have just awakened from what I assume was some form of hibernation. Perhaps you are not aware of the tactical situation. Your modern fleet has already been defeated. Your obsolete vessels pose no threat to crystalline military technology. There was a pause before Kane responded. When he spoke again, his voice carried an undertone that made Rixtal's skin shift to a darker blue. Commander, you've made one critical error in your assessment. We're not your modern fleet. We're the fleet that humanity built when we fought wars that made survival optional. Your 10 minutes just became 5. Commander Rixtal watched his chronometer count down the final seconds of the human ultimatum. He felt no concern about the threat from the ancient human vessels. His crystalline ships had just demonstrated their superiority over humanity's modern fleet. Whatever weapons these older ships carried would be even more primitive and ineffective. All ships maintain formation. Rixtal ordered his fleet. When the humans attack, disable them quickly, but do not destroy them. We want survivors to tell others what happens when inferior species challenge the crystalline dominion. The 5-minute deadline passed without any apparent change in the human formation. The ghost fleet had arranged itself into a loose sphere around the crystalline vessels, but they remained at what seemed like a respectful distance. Rixtal began to wonder if the humans were having second thoughts about their ultimatum. Then, space itself seemed to explode around his fleet. The first indication of attack was not the flash of energy weapons or the streak of missiles. It was the complete failure of his ship's long-range sensors. Every detection system simply went dead, as if something was jamming them across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. In the space of seconds, Rixtal's fleet went from having perfect situational awareness to being essentially blind. What happened to our sensors? Rixtal demanded. Unknown, Commander. His sensor officer replied, his musical voice tight with stress. All frequencies are being jammed simultaneously. The interference pattern is unlike anything in our databases. Before Rixtal could respond, his ship shuddered under impact. Something had struck his vessel's shields, but his defensive sensors showed no incoming projectiles. The hit had come from nowhere with no warning. Then the real attack began. The human ships moved like nothing Rixtal had ever seen before. Instead of the predictable formations used by civilized military forces, they attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, using the asteroids as cover and concealment. Their ships appeared and disappeared from sensor coverage like ghosts, striking and vanishing before the crystalline weapons could lock onto them. Captain Kane stood on the bridge of the TNS Retribution, watching his tactical display with the calm expression of a man who had fought this kind of battle many times before. The Ghost Fleet was performing exactly as it had been designed to do, fighting a technologically superior enemy using tactics that more civilized military forces would never consider. Target their sensor arrays first, Kane ordered. I want them blind before we show them what our main guns can do. The Eclipse-class stealth ships were the first to strike. Captain Sullivan's TNS Eclipse appeared less than 1,000 kilometers from a crystalline vessel, fired a spread of kinetic penetrators at the alien ship's sensor clusters, then vanished back into stealth mode before the enemy could return fire. The projectiles were simple chunks of dense metal, but they were traveling at nearly 10% of light speed. When they struck the crystalline hull, they released energy equivalent to small nuclear weapons. The crystalline ship's shields held, but several of its sensor arrays were destroyed. More importantly, the attack had come from a direction that should have been impossible. The human ship had somehow approached to point-blank range without being detected. How did they get so close? Rickstall shouted. Where did that ship come from? His tactical officer was frantically trying to re-establish sensor contact. Unknown, Commander. Our sensors show empty space in that direction. Either the ship is using some form of advanced stealth technology, or our detection systems are malfunctioning. The truth was that humanity's stealth technology was not more advanced than what the crystalline Dominion used. It was simply different. While the aliens had developed elegant systems that bent light and energy around their ships, humans had taken a more brutal approach. The Eclipse-class ships were coated with materials that absorbed sensor energy and converted it to heat, then radiated that heat in carefully controlled patterns that mimicked cosmic background radiation. The ships were not invisible, but they were invisible enough. The second wave of attacks came from the Terra-class dreadnoughts. These massive ships had moved into position, while the crystalline fleet was focused on the stealth attacks. Now they opened fire with their main weapons. Kinetic bombardment cannons that had been designed for planetary assault operations. Captain Vasquez of the TNS Thanatos watched her targeting display with satisfaction. Target locked. Firing main battery. The kinetic cannon fired a projectile that was essentially a telephone pole made of depleted uranium and tungsten alloy. The projectile was accelerated to relativistic speeds by a magnetic launch system that drew power directly from the ship's fusion reactor. When it struck the crystalline vessel's shields, the impact released more energy than most civilizations used to power their entire homeworlds. The alien ship's shields collapsed entirely. The projectile punched through the crystalline hull like it was made of paper, creating a crater 30 meters wide. Atmosphere vented from the breach and several of the ship's weapon systems went offline. Rickstall stared at his damage reports in disbelief. His shields had been designed to stop any known weapon in the galaxy. They had held against the modern human fleet without even flickering, but this single shot from an ancient human ship had collapsed them completely. Impossible, he whispered. What kind of primitive weapon can generate that much kinetic energy? The answer was that it was not a primitive weapon at all. Humanity had developed kinetic warfare to an art form during their civil wars, when energy weapons were often ineffective against advanced shielding. The Ghost Fleet carried the ultimate expression of that technology, weapons that could crack continents if aimed at planetary targets. All ships, return fire, Rickstall ordered. Concentrate on the largest human vessels. The crystalline ships began firing their plasma weapons at the human dreadnoughts. The elegant energy beams reached out across space, targeting the massive Terra-class ships that seemed too large to dodge effectively. But when the alien weapons struck their targets, the results were not what Rickstall expected. The human ships had armor instead of energy shields, thick layers of composite materials and reactive armor plating that had been designed to withstand kinetic impacts and energy weapons alike. The crystalline plasma beams burned deep into the armor, but they did not penetrate to vital systems. The human ships absorbed the damage and kept fighting. More importantly, the human ships were not trying to avoid damage. They were using their armor to absorb enemy fire while they maneuvered for better firing positions. It was a tactic that no civilized military would consider, accepting damage in order to inflict greater damage on the enemy. Commander, his weapons officer reported, our plasma cannons are not penetrating their armor effectively. The human ships appear to be designed specifically to withstand energy weapons. Rickstall was beginning to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. The human ships were not primitive at all. They were simply designed for a different kind of warfare than anything the galactic powers had experienced. While alien military doctrine emphasized elegant solutions and minimal casualties, human military doctrine was based on overwhelming force and acceptable losses. The third wave of human attacks came from the Nemesis-class destroyers. These smaller ships moved with incredible speed, using high-energy burns that would have been impossible for ships carrying living crews. But the Ghost Fleet crews were not normal humans. They were veterans who had been modified with cybernetic implants and drug treatments that allowed them to survive acceleration forces that would kill ordinary people. Captain Chen's TNS, Nemesis accelerated at nearly 15 gravities. closing the distance to a crystalline ship in seconds. At point-blank range, Chen fired every weapon his ship carried into the alien vessel's damaged hull. Particle beams, kinetic penetrators, and experimental plasma weapons designed during humanity's darkest conflicts. The crystalline ship exploded in a flash of light that was visible from the inner planets. One down, Kane reported to his fleet. 4 targets remaining. Continue the attack. Rixtal watched one of his ships die and felt something he had never experienced before in combat. Fear. Not the healthy caution that every military officer learned to respect, but actual terror at facing an enemy that fought in ways he could not understand or predict. All ships, withdraw to minimum safe distance, he ordered. Signal the fleet reserves. We need reinforcements immediately. Commander, his communications officer reported, we cannot reach the fleet reserves. The humans are jamming all frequencies. We are completely cut off from outside support. Kane smiled grimly as he watched the crystalline ships try to retreat. The aliens were finally learning what humanity had discovered during their civil wars. When your enemy was willing to accept any level of casualties to achieve victory. When they used weapons and tactics that civilized military forces would never consider, the rules of engagement changed completely. Signal all ships, Kane ordered. Pursue and destroy. No alien vessel leaves this system alive. The pursuit lasted for 6 hours. Commander Rixtal's remaining 4 ships tried every evasion tactic known to crystalline military doctrine. But nothing worked against the human ghost fleet. The ancient ships moved with a coordination that seemed impossible, as if they shared a single mind. When one human vessel was damaged, others immediately moved to cover its position. When the aliens tried to concentrate fire on a single target, the human ships used the asteroids themselves as weapons, detonating mining charges to create debris fields that blocked enemy sensors. Rixtal watched his fleet die piece by piece. The humans did not fight like any civilized species he had ever encountered. They used tactics that were brutal, efficient, and completely without mercy. When a crystalline ship was disabled, the humans did not offer surrender terms. They simply destroyed it and moved on to the next target. Commander, his tactical officer reported, the harmony of light has lost main power. The humans are closing in for the kill. Rixtal watched on his screen as 3 human destroyers surrounded the disabled crystalline vessel. They fired simultaneously, their kinetic weapons punching through the crystalline hull from multiple directions. The ship exploded in a shower of crystal fragments and venting atmosphere. Signal the resonance of truth, Rixtal ordered. Tell them to break formation and run for the system edge. Maybe one of us can escape to warn the Dominion. The resonance of truth tried to break away from the battle, but the human stealth ships were waiting. Captain Sullivan's TNS Eclipse appeared directly in the fleeing ship's path, firing a spread of kinetic penetrators into the alien vessel's engine section. The crystalline ship lost propulsion and began tumbling helplessly through space. Commander Rixtal, a human voice came over the communications channel. Captain Kane sounded as calm as if he were discussing the weather. You are the last ship remaining. Surrender now and we will allow you to evacuate your crew to escape pods. Rixtal felt his skin shift to the deep purple color of rage and humiliation. His fleet had been destroyed by ships that he had dismissed as primitive relics. 5 of the crystalline Dominion's finest vessels had been defeated by human technology that was supposedly obsolete. Human captain, Rixtal replied, you may have won this battle, but you have doomed your entire species. When the Dominion learns what has happened here, they will send a fleet that will turn your homeworld into glass. Kane's reply was immediate and carried an undertone that made Rixtal's skin shift to pale blue. Commander, your people seem to have a fundamental misunderstanding about humanity. You think this fleet represents our full military capability. You're wrong. What do you mean? Rixtal demanded. This is just our old equipment, Kane explained. The ships we put into storage after our civil wars ended. Our modern military is building new vessels right now, incorporating everything we learned from 30 years of fighting each other. The ships that defeated you today are museum pieces compared to what we're building for the next war. Rixtal felt something cold settle in his chest. If these ancient human ships could destroy a crystalline fleet, what could their modern military accomplish? You have 30 seconds to abandon ship, Kane continued. After that, we will open fire. Rixtal made the hardest decision of his military career. All hands abandon ship. Evacuate to escape pods immediately. The escape pods launched just as the human ships opened fire. Rixtel watched from his pod as his flagship, the Crystal Song, was torn apart by kinetic weapons that turned the beautiful crystalline hull into clouds of glittering fragments. In less than a minute, nothing remained of his fleet except debris and the small escape pods drifting through space. Captain Kane opened a channel to the escape pods. "Commander Rixtel, you and your crews will be escorted to the edge of the system and released. You will carry a message back to your government and to the Galactic Council." "What message?" Rixtel asked quietly. "Tell them that humanity is not as defenseless as they believed. Tell them that we have been preparing for this day since we first learned that we were not alone in the galaxy. And tell them that if they want to test our defenses again, they should bring more ships." The escape pods were picked up by human vessels and transported to the system edge, where they were released with enough supplies to reach the nearest crystalline outpost. As Rixtel's pod drifted away from the Sol system, he composed his report to the Crystalline High Command. It was not a report he wanted to write. The human fleet had not just defeated them. They had made it look easy. Worse, the humans had shown a level of military sophistication that the Galactic Intelligence Services had completely missed. The ships they called obsolete were more advanced than anything in the crystalline military. Back in the asteroid belt, the Ghost Fleet was already returning to its dormant positions. The crews had completed their mission and were preparing to return to cryosleep. But there was a difference now. The ship's computer systems remained active, monitoring deep space sensors and maintaining communication links with Earth Defense Command. Captain Kane stood on his bridge one last time before returning to his cryopod. The battle had lasted less than a day, but it had changed everything. Humanity was no longer an unknown factor in galactic politics. They had announced their presence in a way that no one could ignore. "Captain," Lieutenant Commander Voss reported, "we're receiving a transmission from Admiral Morrison. Earth Defense Command wants to know if we should remain active." Kane considered the question. The Ghost Fleet had been designed for humanity's darkest hour, when the species faced extinction. That hour had passed, but Kane suspected it would come again. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and humanity had just made some very powerful enemies. "Tell the Admiral that we'll return to sleep," Kane decided. "But keep the emergency protocols active. Something tells me this was just the beginning." 3 days later, the reports reached the Galactic Council. The Crystalline Dominion had lost an entire fleet to human forces. The Bioswarm Collective and the Zephyrian Empire had begun emergency reviews of their intelligence assessments. Humanity was no longer classified as a dependent species requiring protection. Admiral Vexitar of the Zephyrian Empire read the reports with growing concern. His own fleet had been in the Sol system just weeks before, observing what they thought were derelict human ships. The implications were disturbing. If humanity had been hiding their true military capabilities, what else had the galactic powers misunderstood about this young species? The answer came in the form of new intelligence reports from the inner system. Human shipyards that had been building civilian vessels were now working around the clock on military projects. The designs were unlike anything in the galactic databases, incorporating technology that seemed to combine the worst aspects of every military doctrine in known space. Humanity was building a war fleet, not the elegant, efficient vessels favored by the galactic powers, but ships designed for total warfare. Ships that could fight outnumbered and win. Ships that carried weapons capable of destroying entire worlds if necessary. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session to discuss the human situation. For the first time in centuries, they faced a species that had demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to fight the galactic powers on equal terms. The humans had not asked for a place at the table of galactic politics. They had taken it by force. In the depths of space, the Ghost Fleet waited. The crew slept peacefully in their cryopods, confident that they had done their duty. They had shown the galaxy that humanity was not defenseless, not weak, and definitely not dependent on the protection of alien powers. But they had also shown something else. They had demonstrated that humanity was a species that remembered its enemies and prepared for the next war, even while hoping for peace. The ships drifting silently in the asteroid belt were not just weapons. They were a promise that if anyone threatened Earth again, they would face not just humanity's modern military, but the accumulated experience of a species that had learned to fight for survival, when surrender meant extinction. The aliens had awakened something that they could not put back to sleep. The Ghost Fleet had returned to its vigil, But the galaxy would never be the same. Humanity had announced its presence as a major military power, and the other species would have to decide whether they wanted humanity as an ally or an enemy. But they could no longer dismiss humans as primitives playing with obsolete technology. The relics had roared to life, and their message was clear. Earth was defended by those who remembered when survival was not guaranteed, and they would not allow their world to fall while they still drew breath. The communications officer on the bridge of the Zephyrian dreadnought Eternal Glory looked up from his console with confusion written across his scaled features. Admiral Kextar, we're receiving strange signals from the third planet in this system. Admiral Kextar turned his massive frame toward the officer. His 6 eyes blinked in sequence as he processed the information. Strange how? The transmissions are primitive, sir. Radio waves, electromagnetic pulses, even something called internet traffic. But there's so much of it. The entire planet seems to be chattering constantly. Kextar moved to the view screen where the blue and green world hung like a jewel against the black of space. His tactical display showed a standard analysis. 1 inhabited world, primitive technology level, no apparent spacefaring capability beyond crude orbital platforms. The computer had already assigned it a designation, Terra 3. How many inhabitants? Kextar asked. Computer estimates 8 billion, sir. All concentrated on the surface and in low orbit. Kextar's mandibles clicked in amusement. 8 billion primitives crammed onto a single world. It would be like shooting fish in a barrel, as the humans themselves might say, though he didn't know that expression yet. Send the standard Imperial greeting, he ordered. Demand immediate surrender and submission to the Galactic Empire. Give them 1 solar rotation to comply. The message went out across all human frequencies, translated into their major languages by the Empire's sophisticated computers. It was the same message that had been sent to thousands of worlds over 3 millennia. Submit or be destroyed. Kneel before the might of the Zephyrian Empire. The response came back within hours, much faster than expected. The communications officer looked puzzled as he read the translation. Sir, they sent back what appears to be diplomatic messages, multiple ones from different groups on the planet. They're asking for peaceful negotiations and cultural exchange. Cultural exchange? Kextar's laugh was a harsh sound that echoed through the bridge. They want to negotiate? Do they not understand what we just told them? There's more, sir. After the diplomatic messages, we received another transmission. Much shorter. Play it. A human voice filled the bridge, speaking in clear, simple words that the translation computers had no trouble processing. To the unknown vessels in our system, we appreciate your interest in diplomatic contact. However, we must respectfully decline your demand for surrender. Earth will remain free. We hope you'll reconsider your position and engage in peaceful dialogue instead. The bridge fell silent. In 3,000 years of expansion, no primitive world had ever declined the Empire's generous offer of slavery. They usually begged for mercy or tried to hide. They didn't politely refuse and invite further discussion. Sir, the tactical officer spoke up, his voice uncertain. We're detecting movement from their orbital platforms. They appear to be repositioning. Kextar studied the display. The primitive space stations were indeed moving, but slowly and without apparent urgency. It looked almost defensive, like animals circling their young. How many ships do we have in the system? Kextar asked. 200 dreadnoughts, sir. Standard patrol strength for pacifying a primitive world. Kextar nodded. 200 ships was overkill for any single planet, especially one without apparent space forces. But the Empire had learned long ago that overwhelming force prevented messy rebellions later. Signal the fleet. Prepare to demonstrate Imperial power. Target their largest cities for orbital bombardment. Perhaps seeing their capitals burn will help them understand their situation. The fleet moved into attack formation. 200 massive warships spreading across space like a steel net. Each dreadnought was 3 kilometers long and carried enough firepower to crack continents. Against a primitive world, they were essentially invincible. That's when things started going wrong. The first sign was when the Empire's targeting computers began having difficulty locking onto the orbital platforms. The stations seemed to shimmer and blur, as if space itself was bending around them. Sir, we're getting strange readings from their defensive positions, reported the tactical officer. Our sensors are having trouble maintaining clear images. Technical malfunction, Kextar dismissed. Continue the attack. The Empire ships opened fire. sending streams of plasma and particle beams toward the human orbital platforms. The energy should have vaporized the crewed stations instantly. Instead, the beams simply vanished. What just happened? Kekstar demanded. Sir, our weapons fire appears to have been absorbed, deflected? I'm not sure. The platforms are still intact and functional. Before Kekstar could respond, new contacts appeared on the tactical display. Ships were emerging from behind the planet's moon, sleek vessels barely a tenth the size of Imperial dreadnoughts. How many? Kekstar asked, though he wasn't particularly worried. Small ships were no threat to Imperial armor. 50. No, wait, 100. Sir? More are appearing from the asteroid belt, and from behind the gas giant. Sir, how many ships do these primitives have? The answer came in the form of weapons fire. Thin beams of coherent energy lanced out from the human ships, precise and impossibly focused. They sliced through Imperial shields like they weren't there, and cut into armor that had withstood the test of 1,000 battles. The dreadnought mighty talons simply came apart. 3 kilometers of Imperial engineering reduced to expanding gas and metal fragments in seconds. Shield status, Kekstar barked. Shields are holding on our ship, sir, but barely. Whatever they're using, it's not like anything in our databases. More Imperial ships died. The humans moved their vessels with impossible precision, dancing between plasma bursts and particle beams like they could predict where the shots would go. Their smaller ships worked in perfect coordination, covering each other and striking with surgical accuracy. Sir, the Iron Will is reporting they've lost main power. The Stellar Fist has lost navigation. The humans are targeting our systems, not trying to destroy us outright. Kekstar watched in growing horror as his fleet was systematically dismantled. The humans weren't just winning. They were showing mercy, disabling ships instead of destroying them. It was the kind of behavior he'd expect from a superior civilization, not from primitives who should be cowering in fear. Sir, incoming transmission from the human forces. Put it through. A new voice filled the bridge. Calm and professional. Imperial vessels. This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Seoul Defense Force. Your fleet is outmatched. We're prepared to accept your surrender and guarantee safe passage out of our system for your survivors. We don't want to kill anyone who doesn't force us to. The words hit Kekstar like a physical blow. A primitive was offering him terms. A single-world species was promising him safe passage. It was impossible. How many ships have we lost? He asked quietly. 188 destroyed or disabled, sir. Only 12 vessels remain combat-capable. Kekstar looked at the tactical display showing the remaining human ships. There were hundreds of them now, small and fast and deadly. His mighty fleet had been reduced to wreckage in less than 6 hours. Signal retreat, he said, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. All remaining ships jumped to hyperspace immediately. As the Eternal Glory prepared to flee, Kekstar took one last look at the blue world that had just humiliated the Galactic Empire. Somewhere down there, 8 billion primitives were going about their daily lives, probably unaware that they had just achieved the impossible. The jump to hyperspace engaged and Earth disappeared behind them. But Kekstar knew this wasn't over. The Empire had suffered its first defeat in 3 millennia, and Emperor Zalthane would demand answers. More importantly, he would demand revenge.